Day 2 geometry. Oh yeah, special quadrilaterals, so much fun. I'm not going to read through all these, but these are things you did learn in geometry. So I look them over, highlight, try to remember, try to study, put them together. First thing is telling you it's a parallelogram. So actually I'm going to do B because A is easier. So I'm being nice to you. So if I'm doing B and I know this is parallelogram, one thing that's for sure is that my opposite angles are congruent. So angle 1 is going to be equal to 113. I also know that I could figure out what angle 3 is because this makes a triangle right here. So I could do 180 minus 113 minus 45, and I would get, 180 minus 45 minus 113, and I get that angle 3 is equal to 22. Now, one thing that you can remember about a parallelogram that the opposite sides are parallel, and if I do this, I could have also known that angle 3 is equal to 22 because these two are alternate interior angles. I can do that same thing right here because if you have me in geometry, you know this is what I call the pinchers, so angle 2 would be equal to 45 because of alternate interior angles. So I'm not going to do A here because one thing, you should look at the properties and you should know that the opposite sides are congruent, so you can set those two sides equal to each other. Now if I'm looking for X and Y, in a parallelogram, diagonals bisect each other. So what that means is that these two guys are congruent. This is just a parallelogram and these two guys are congruent. So I can set up the equation 2x is equal to 4 and y minus 1 is equal to 2y minus 7. So if I divide that by 2, x is equal to 2. If I subtract y, I get y, and then add over 7, I get y is equal to 6. So that would be using their properties there. So what about my special? So I want you to solve C by yourself. And you can use that information either by knowing that opposite sides or angles are congruent. However, the other thing that for parallelogram are consecutive angles next to each other are supplementary. That will also help you solve for what x is, and then you can plug it in for y. But special right triangles, special parallelograms. We have rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Oh my! So when you're looking at a shape, in this shape, it only shows that all the sides are congruent. If you go back to that first page, all the sides are congruent. That is just for a rhombus. That's the only information we have on this picture. We don't have anything else, so we can only say rhombus. Now, the second one, we know for sure it's a parallelogram. So if it's a parallelogram, we have to look at our properties of a parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent, so that means these will also be the same. And opposite angles are congruent, so that would have to be 90 degrees. And angles, they're consecutive, so these two angles and these two angles are supplementary. So that means these have to be 90 because 180 minus 90 will give you 90. So now it's easier to see what do I have going on here. All my sides are congruent. All my angles are congruent. There's only one shape that has that, and that would be a square. So again, most of these questions, you have to go back to that first page for day 2 to look at the properties of our shapes. But saying that's a rectangle. So if you look at the rectangle, you know what we know about diagonals of a rectangle. Diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. So I can do 2x plus 15 because diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. And then solve it. You should check your work with my work in class. If you know this is a square, now one thing that's very important to know is that a square is a rhombus and a rectangle. So anything that's true for a square or anything that's true for a rectangle or a rhombus is also true for a square. Now in a rhombus, diagonals are perpendicular. Diagonals are perpendicular. That means this angle right here is 90 degrees because a square is a rectangle. So I can do 6x plus 6 is equal to 90 and solve. So if we actually try to look at what shapes are these. So in this first one, I'm actually going to just explain to you what's shown on the picture, and then you have to go back, look at your properties, and see what's going on here. So in this first one, there's just one thing here. This diagonal is bisecting opposite angles. So if you try to look back at your properties to figure out diagonals bisect opposite angles, what would it be? There's two things that I'm showing here. First off, I see that there's this 90 degrees at the diagonals. So that's showing me the diagonals are perpendicular. It also shows me that these four parts are the same. That means this whole length and this whole length are the same. So that would be saying that my diagonals are congruent. So again, look at the properties to see what would give you diagonals congruent, diagonals are perpendicular. This one's saying that this diagonal is congruent to this diagonal. So what shape would that be? Or my diagonals are perpendicular here. So go back to your list and see which one you think it might be. So for this next one, special parallelogram still, your properties. So what is showing me on this picture is this diagonal is bisecting these two parts because it's a rhombus. A rhombus means this diagonal cuts this angle in half. Now if it cuts it in half, that means I know that 6x minus 2 will be equal to 4x plus 8. And then I would solve that. So if I were to solve that, I would subtract my 4, add my 2, x would be equal to 5. Now this one's saying it's a rectangle. Remember, in the rectangle, diagonals are congruent. And because diagonals are congruent and in a parallelogram, they bisect, that means all these 4 little guys are congruent. So I want you to figure out why by yourself. And then once you do that, I want you to have a fantastic, just the most amazing time of your life. Have a good one.